Hello! Today we are going to talk about 5 composition techniques that I just keep coming back to in my own songwriting practice. Hopefully there's something new here that you can get excited about. Let's hook into it and find out. The first thing that I love to do is adding a half bar in. So if we were in 4/4, that would mean chucking in a bar of 2 somewhere. So that might be a consistent thing that you add. Say, for example, you've got a verse that's 7 bars plus a bar of 2/4. Or maybe it's just something that only occurs once in the song. So often I use it as a second verse variation. So if I've got an 8 bar first verse, then I might do that 7 bar plus 1/2 bar in the second verse, just to unbalance it and create a bit of variation. You could do the same thing in 3/4 like this. And you can also do it in compound meters. So if we were in 6/8, for example, it'd sound like this. And a variation on this technique is basically just changing the bar length. So for example, if you were in 9/8, you might add a bar of 6 in there just to take off those 3 beats and add variation. Or if you're in 4/4, maybe you add a bar of 5 in there. So basically just creating a bit of extra flavor with a time signature variation. It can be super effective and quite subtle as well. Like often these things listeners don't necessarily pick up on the first listen. You can make it quite seamless. All that a listener gets is a feeling of imbalance or a feeling of dragged time or compounded time, right? Rather than necessarily hearing, oh, there's been a shift in the rhythm, what's going on? They're just feeling what your intention is rather than necessarily the technique, which I think is really cool. I love that sort of stuff. The next technique is line cliches. So for those of you who don't know, a line cliche is where you have a chord progression where the majority of the notes stay the same and only one changes between the chords. So you could have that changing note in any position in the chord. If you put it at the top, you might end up with something a little like this. We're looking at 7th chords here, so 4-note chords. If you add it in the middle, you could get something like this. With the 2nd chord tone, you get something like this. And probably the most common one we get is at the bottom of the chord, so a descending line like this, which is often mirrored in the bass as well. But that being said, it can also be really nice if you've got that bottom note of the chord descending to have a static bass note or one that's moving in the opposite direction to the descending riff in the harmony. So those oral examples should have kicked in there, but let's just quickly take a second to focus on that. So if we've got the bass, and in this case piano, moving in the same direction with that bottom note line cliche, that would go like this. If the bass stays static, we've got this. And if the bass moves in the opposite direction, we get this. It's pretty cool. You can have them ascending or descending or a combination of the two. So there's quite a lot of flexibility in there, and that can be used in triads, 7ths, 9ths, like any chord, anything, any progression, as long as you've got the majority of the notes staying the same while one changes in a stepwise motion. So that could be chromatic, so that being just semitones, or it could be diatonic, which may be a combination of tones and semitones, or it could be tones as well. That one can sound a little bit bizarre, but you can go wild there. The next technique are borrowed chords. I did do a full video on what borrowed chords are. I'll put that somewhere here in case you need it. But basically a borrowed chord is a chord that doesn't belong in the key that you're working in. So if I'm in a major key, I often add a major 2nd, a major 3rd, a minor 4th, or a minor 5th. They're the ones that I really enjoy in there. But the other thing that I really enjoy doing, which again I unpack fully in the other video if you need, but basically it's where you find a middle ground between diatonic chords. Say for example we were going between these 2 chords, we're going to find the middle ground here. And it's almost like bridging the gap in the harmonic progression by adding a borrowed chord that's not diatonic to the key, but brings the chords together in a way that makes sense. And mostly the logic I use there is, what's in the middle? What's the middle ground that I can see between two chords, and how am I going to fill it? And that's how I work it out there. The next thing are shifts in melodic register. So you can do this with vocals if you're singing, or it can also be just the melody if you're doing an instrumental composition. And basically it just means that in different sections of the song, you have the melody placed in a different register to the other sections, and it creates this really nice sense of variation between the sections, without, having to go down the road of key changes or massive instrumental adjustments, whatever. It's just a really straightforward way of creating variation and keeping interest in your song. If you've got a verse sitting in that sort of octave, you jump up and do a chorus up there. You can also just change how many notes you're using in a section. So for example, maybe you have a verse melody or an A section melody that's quite contained. Maybe it only uses 3 notes. And then in the chorus, you suddenly leap up in register, you're going up an octave, and suddenly the gap between the top note and the bottom note that you're singing or playing
is much larger than what we've already heard.
So it's just that thing of going, okay, what have I done in the melody so far, and how can I change it? Basically just options for expanding your melody, creating variation and development really easily, really simply. The last technique that I love at the moment, and I can't see myself moving away from anytime soon, is just going absolutely flippin' wild with your structures. So if we're looking at a song with a vocal part, so lyrics, and accompaniment, these are the normal sections we would expect to hear, right? If we're looking at like a traditional version of a song as like intro, verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, why not change up the order to make something a bit less expected for you and the listener, and find a way to make that effective and make each part still effectively play their role. So if we're just looking at that traditional structure there, we could immediately change that by putting the second verse right at the end of the song instead. When the listener gets back to that verse, we still have that sense of familiarity in terms of we've heard it before. We know what we're listening for, but there's been a lot of other stuff in between, and we weren't necessarily expecting to hear that verse again at that point in the song. You can also get playful with your use of pre-choruses, post-choruses, instrumental sections, and then again, to slightly expand on this idea, you can just change the duration of your sections. So perhaps the most classic version of this is if you've got a 16 bar verse to start with, making it a half verse the second time you hear it. So 16 bars the first verse, 8 bars the second verse. But you can be really strategic with the duration of your sections to propel the movement of the song. So for example, if we took something like a pre-chorus, which is supposed to build tension, right? It's supposed to build momentum to hit the chorus and have that like oomph when you finally get to hear that chorus, right? So if we make that pre-chorus 3 bars or 5 bars, not necessarily an even number of bars that we're more expecting to hear, especially if you've established an even number of bars in the verse, then that can be a really effective way to mix up your structure and just create some movement and interest within the structure itself, while keeping the roles of the different sections consistent. So if we're turning a pre-chorus into something that it's just a whole new section in itself and doesn't actually set up the chorus, then it's not a pre-chorus anymore. So if you're sitting there going, great, I'm going to make a 9-bar pre-chorus that, nobody's going to expect and everybody's going to feel like, what the heck's this? What's going on? It's not really a pre-chorus. That's kind of just a whole other section. Maybe it's a bridge, maybe it's a B section, maybe your verse is an A section, that's a B section, and then your chorus is a C section, if you want to call it that. You just want to keep in mind that if you're getting creative with your structure, you need to understand what the roles of the different parts are and how to still use them in an effective way. And in a kind of similar way to the first technique that we talked about, you can just add or take away a bar or two wherever you want. So maybe your first chorus is 4 bars, and then your second chorus is 5 bars. Again, it's just another way to make your music slightly more unexpected and honestly like powerful if you're using it in the right way. You can get that chorus to slap real hard with a 3-bar pre-chorus if you use it right. So yeah, just make it work for you. But those are the 5 techniques that I love and I'm using all the time at the moment. So hopefully that's been helpful and brought some new ideas maybe into your own songwriting practice. But let me know if you've got any questions, and I'll catch you in the next one.